After leaving government, Henry Kissinger still continued to be an influential China advisor for decades to come. He maintained a strong relationship with Chinese leaders and continued to influence U.S. policy towards China. My next guest worked closely with Kissinger back in the Nixon administration and then continued on as a close collaborator up until his death. Here's my conversation with Robert Hormats. I met Hormats in New York City. You have such a storied, lengthy relationship with Dr. Kissinger. You've known him I interviewed you right after his death, and you were rather wistful about it. The loss was tangible. To see him and to see how he operates, how much do you think was kind of formed in his childhood in terms of his diplomatic style?
Well, that's a good question. I worked with him from the time I was 24. He gave me my first job. He was by far my most important mentor in life, all the way through from the time I started. He said, at one point, he says, I have a lot more confidence in you than you have in yourself. He said, you can do these things, even though I was just a grad student at the time. He gave me a lot of things to do in terms of preparing documents and things for the president's trip and for subsequent trips on the economic side of the equation. And we became very good friends. We talked quite regularly on the phone. He, in fact, talked to me just before he left for his last trip to China, where he focused a great deal on AI. And when he was invited, he said to the Chinese, I will go. He's 100 years old, mind you. He said, I want to go. He saw the relationship deteriorating, so he wanted to go and see what he could do to stabilize it. That was his main goal. But he also said that I want to be sure that we don't just discuss geostrategic and geopolitical issues. I want to be sure that we give equal time to AI. So he actually discussed AI quite a bit with Xi Jinping. It was sort of Kissinger's diplomatic thinking evolved. He was always ahead of the curve. And that's what I found in working for him. In the beginning, he didn't have much interest in economic issues. And then, of course, there was China, where in the beginning we had no economic ties whatsoever, no trade, no investment relations at all. So he said, why don't you write up a little something on what we can do, a few little things we can do that will build confidence. So I did that. And we did a couple of things on our own, but the Chinese didn't reciprocate. And then we learned that it was sort of a bureaucratic thing in China. How do you deal with the Americans on economic issues? But Mao told him, well, we actually want to do a few little things. We want to do this. So when you add up the oil crisis and the dollar issue at Camp David, which caused a lot of fury among the Allies because they weren't told in advance, and then the China relationship, he became very aware that economic issues had a strategic role in the world and were strategically related to some of the other things he was trying to do. So I learned from that he had a very open mind. He had a very fertile mind. How he could link all these things together. For someone with very little experience in them, he became a master of these, and learned a lot about them and became actually quite interested in them. And whatever he did, he took a lot of interest in. He didn't just do things peripherally. He did them in a very centered and focused way.
Robert Hormats served as Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth and now is vice chairman of Kissinger's Associates. Just from a historical standpoint, even when you look back on it now, it was dramatic, and it changed the course of history, not just for the United States, but China and that relationship.
Absolutely. Well, the trip was interesting in a number of senses. From my personal point of view, being involved to a degree, it was still a surprise, because prior to the trip, he went around the table of his staff and asked if anyone knew anything about China. And I'd never been there, of course. No one there had ever been there. But I was in Tanzania when they were building the Tanzam Railway, which China was financing. It was really the first Belt and Road type project. And in the dorm I was staying in was the chief engineer for the project, who was Chinese. So I got to know him. He said, we're not supposed to talk to one another, China, U.S., but he had actually been to school in the U.S. for a couple of years. He knew something about it. So we would have lunch and dinner periodically, and he told me a bit about China, and I learned a lot. And he was interested in the U.S. because he knew a little bit about the U.S. So Kissinger had a couple of China experts, but I raised my hand. I said, I've had conversations years ago with some Chinese as well. So he said, why don't you write papers? I was his economic advisor. He said, why don't you write a couple of papers on the Chinese economy? So I did that, not knowing what they were for, but I figured he's a professor, he's interested in China, so write the papers. So wrote them, and then I heard nothing. And then I wake up one morning, and I hear on the radio that he had surreptitiously gone to China. The pretext was that he was in Pakistan and he had a stomach ache, and therefore he was out of communication with the press for a couple of days. So then I learned he didn't have a stomach ache at all. He had gone to China, and of course it was news to me, but it was once he got back and we sort of learned that there was then going to be a presidential trip. It really struck me that this was history in the making, and he had done it in such a Kissingerian way, in his own way, using a Pakistani airplane. He went with a couple of people, Winston Lord, John Holdridge, Dick Solomon, who I'd worked with on a fairly regular basis, but it was still a very surprise. A big surprise. No one knew about it.
Henry Kissinger was born in Germany to a Jewish family that fled Nazi persecution and emigrated to the United States. As a teenager, he worked in a shaving brush factory while excelling in his studies and developing a lifelong passion for history and politics. How do you think, though, his childhood impacted him, do you think, from a diplomatic standpoint, to have the kind of childhood that he had?
I think that his childhood in Germany was a critical element of his ability to focus on new challenges. I think it was a very challenging childhood, certainly growing up as a Jew in Germany at that time was challenging. And I think it gave him a sense of persistence and a determination that he was going to be able, that he was going to focus on overcoming obstacles, that he was going to focus on adversity, because he was really doing relatively little. At one point he said to me, if I'd been in Germany, either I'd be dead or I'd be teaching at a high school. And he said neither one of those were, in my judgment, good options. So when he came here, he was always looking for opportunities to improve his lot in life. He was always looking for opportunities. He went to Harvard. He didn't just go to Harvard, but he wrote the the longest dissertation ever written for a Harvard PhD. When he got out of Harvard, he was not simply, or when he finished his PhD, he was not simply focused on being a professor, but he wanted to get into and become acquainted with the politics of the country. So he became an advisor to Nelson Rockefeller. There was always a way of taking something that could be, for most people, the end of, or sort of their career trap, in a way, that they would do this for the rest of their lives. He was always thinking, how can I use what I've learned to move myself up to another level and another level and another level? How can I use what I've learned to learn more? It was never about the learning or the dissertation being enough. I mean, he wrote a long dissertation, and it got published, but it was never sufficient. He always had goals that were beyond where he was at the time, mentally and from a career point of view.
And I think everything you just said lays the framework for what happened between U.S.-China relations, because as a lifetime learner, he also kind of learned about the culture, the style, the cadence of the Chinese in order to actually reach a deal, right?
You have put your finger on a key word, and that is, he said, on a regular basis, when we were in the airplane going over to Beijing or wherever we were going, the Middle East too, where we did the Sinai disengagement negotiations, he always said that you need to understand the culture of the country you were dealing with. You needed to understand their culture, and you needed to understand where they were coming from. You needed to know more about their positions than they did. Now, that was a little bit, there was a little humor in that, but it was basically the case that he read about the Chinese culture, the various dynasties in the Middle East. He was not really a Middle East expert, but when we went on these trips, he would read about the history of Saudi Arabia, the history of Jordan, the history of Syria. We went to all these Middle East capitals on a regular basis, and he wanted to be knowledgeable about the history, the culture, the Quran, things of this sort, because he would always inject little vignettes about the culture, just to demonstrate that he had studied it and he understood it.
Henry Kissinger's efforts helped reduce China's isolation, paving the way for trade, investment, and eventual economic reforms that fueled its rapid growth. Talk to me about the development model of China, just the explosion in growth, so many people lifted out of poverty. I mean, just the changes that this action kind of created, in a sense.
For years, they were really making very basic things which did not have a very big market in the U.S. And then Deng Xiaoping came along, and I had the pleasure of talking and meeting with him a lot. He made his visit to southern China, and he really, I think, had a vision for China. He said, China in centuries past was the technological leader of the world. Gunpowder, paper, a whole range of things. China was really the sort of the center of the Asian economies. Americans, you learn about history from Greece westward, Athens, but you don't really have any sense of Asian history. But Asian history is centered on the Middle Kingdom, and we were a very highly technological country at that point. And I had the sense that he was conveying a message that we were able to do that and willing and wanting to do that again. And then the next trip, you'd see one or two quite modern buildings spring up, and then more and more and more. And then don't forget the schools, the universities were closed during the Cultural Revolution. Deng opened the universities. When that happened, there were lots of Chinese who then studied technology, engineering, and then he opened up to allow more and more Chinese to come to the U.S. or Americans to come to China. And a lot of them went to, Caltech, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, places like that to learn stuff that they weren't able to learn in China because they weren't that far advanced. But they were such good students in the U.S., they picked up a huge amount and brought it back to China. And then that tradition of medical cooperation, which did start with the Rockefeller Hospital, and that was about over 100 years ago. And medical collaboration between Chinese researchers and doctors and American researchers and doctors is a fabulous thing. There's almost no paper written today on a serious medical research project that's not co-written with an American and a Chinese doctor or researcher. So there's this evolved very quickly, almost to the point where when you'd go there and then you'd go there 6 months later, it would look like a different China.
Henry Kissinger consistently argued for diplomatic and economic engagement with China, believing that cooperation was in the best interest of both nations. As you know, Kissinger is seen as an old friend of China, and it's a lengthy relationship that dated up, as you mentioned, he visited even when he was 100. What do you think are some of the diplomatic strategies that he put in place that still exist today, and what's his legacy, would you say?
I think his legacy was, first of all, he had a very clear view that any demonstration of weakness is going to lead countries who are your adversaries to think you're going to be even weaker. If you make a concession here or there, ultimately you had to make some compromise, for sure. He knew that. He knew compromise was not a dirty word. But if you did it prematurely or you did it in a non-thoughtful way, you would just convince other countries that they could get more out of you. So he was very careful in how he made concessions, or how he developed compromises. And he, I think, always understood that if you're going to have effective diplomacy, you have to have a strong military capability. You had to have a strong military deterrent capacity in order to be a credible negotiator. And deterrence, from his point of view, was extremely important. If a country thought it could take advantage of you, that you weren't fully prepared from a military point of view, then it would. And I always felt that he sort of understood that link between deterrence and the ability to convince the other guy, A, that you had the military strength to counter what they were planning to do, but you also had the will. And having weapons without the will to use them was going to also lead to their view that your deterrence was sort of feckless or insufficient or inadequate, or that you just didn't have the internal strength. And one of the things he was always worried about, this goes to Vietnam, was that if a country sees us as divided internally, whoever it was, in that case it was the Soviet Union, but it can apply anywhere, that if he sees the U.S. as divided and irresolute and without a strong common sense of its own interests, then other countries would take advantage of those internal divisions. In the end, if other countries see that you're able internally to pull your political system together and to pull your leaders together around a common thread internally, it gave a signal that you're able to do that externally. Whereas if you're divided internally, you're going to be seen as somewhat divided or irresolute or unable to act externally. So,
Well, this has been great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
thanks.